He went to the street market to buy meat, but ended up buying a widowed Apache woman instead. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Arroyo Ford smelled of blood and onions by midday, the kind of smell that settled into the throat and stayed there, made worse by the heat that clung low even in late autumn. Sun beating down on canvas stalls where men hawked salt pork, horse feed, and boots with split soles, while stray dogs circled the butcher's blocks and flies thickened in the corners of the open-air meat stand near the livery, where the real crowd had formed. Rowan Pike tied his gelding to a work post beside the water trough, not bothering with the knot since the animal wasn't going anywhere, not with the dust in the air and the tension thick enough to make even the dumbest beast uneasy. He moved slow, deliberate, the same way he'd learned to in the cavalry, when every sudden gesture might cost a man his breath. His face stayed unreadable under the shadow of his sun-faded hat, his eyes scanning the square not for prices or deals but for exits, habits he hadn't shaken in years and didn't intend to. His boots thudded steady against the packed dirt as he stepped around a pail of guts and caught sight of the gathering by the livery rail. He knew the look of that kind of crowd, a half-circle of men leaning on fence posts and shifting from boot to boot, some spitting, some sneering, all looking in the same direction. Not at a mule or an ox or a saddle horse, but a woman, her wrists bound with rawhide, her hair caught in her mouth from the wind, her deerskin dress torn at the neckline and again down one side, so that the outline of her ribs and the slope of her chest showed through. Unchosen and unprotected, and no one was laughing. But there was something worse than laughter in the air, a kind of bored cruelty, like a game they'd seen before. The man standing nearest her had a slip of paper in one hand and a whip looped on his belt, his voice loud and full of false authority as he read off the so-called terms of the indenture, some debt owed by her dead husband, passed down to her like poison, now to be collected with coin or flesh. He moved slow, deliberate, the same way he'd learned to in the cavalry, when every sudden gesture might cost a man his breath. His face stayed unreadable under the shadow of his sun-faded hat, his eyes scanning the square not for prices or deals, but for exits, habits he hadn't shaken in years and didn't intend to. His boots thudded steady against the packed dirt as he stepped around a pail of guts and caught sight of the gathering by the livery rail. Rowan didn't listen. He didn't need to. The shape of it was plain that he walked straight through the ring of men, didn't shove, didn't speak, just stepped between two pairs of boots until he stood in front of the woman and the one holding her rope. The handler paused mid-sentence, eyes flicking up at Rowan's build, then down at the sidearm visible beneath his open coat, then to the knife on Rowan's belt that was clean but heavy, the kind used to skin hogs, or gut a man if it came to that. How much? Rowan said, voice low but not quiet. The handler stammered something about terms, contract, conditions, but Rowan was already pulling bills from his coat pocket, not looking at the amount, just counting until the muttering stopped and the rope was dropped, the crowd shifting uneasily now, realizing the fun was over. The woman looked at him then, not grateful, not afraid, just steady, her gaze level and sharp despite the cracked skin at her lips and the dried blood near her temple. Name? Rowan asked. Naeli, she answered, her voice rough from thirst but cleared. He nodded once, pulled the cork from his canteen, and handed it to her. She drank in small swallows, careful not to spill. When she finished, he reached into his saddlebag and took out his coat, draping it over her shoulders without touching skin, then looked back once at the ring of men who were now suddenly very interested in their boots. They left the square without a word, but not without being watched. Mrs. Reyes, the storekeeper with arms like fence rails and a gaze that cut through men like wind through chaff, stepped out from behind her counter and pressed a folded shawl into Rowan's hand as they passed, said nothing, just gave the kind of nod that meant she'd seen too much to be shocked anymore. The ride north was silent, the horse's breath steaming in the rising chill, the wind dry and sharp, kicking up dust that caught in the woman's hair as she clutched the shawl tighter, her eyes scanning the horizon like a woman who had learned not to trust calm skies. Rowan pointed once toward a line of hills, said only cabins that way. She didn't respond, but she didn't ask to be taken anywhere else. That'd be by the time they reached the homestead. The sun was down behind the draw, and the wind had gone from sharp to cold. The place was small, one room, low roof, chimney puffing smoke, lean-to stacked with split wood, fence posts in a pile by the corral that wasn't finished. Behind the cottonwood, two small grave markers, plain wood, no names carved. Inside, the cabin was warm but plain, stove glowing, a crate beside it, bedrolls near the wall, shelves with beans, jerky, a dinner tin of salt, and a long-handled kettle. Rowan hung the coat by the door, pointed to the basin near the stove. There's water warm. Then he turned his back and busied himself with the pot of beans, pulled jerky from the shelf, broke it into the pot with slow fingers. When he turned back, she was still at the basin, washing carefully, using one of his old shirts to cover the tear in her dress. She didn't ask. He hadn't expected her to. They ate without speaking. After, she took her place on the bedroll closest to the wall, her back pressed to it, eyes open. He laid the knife on the crate between them, closer to her than to him, then settled on his side with the rifle within reach, his breath slow, not from sleep, but from habit that in the deep of night, a board shifted in the wind, and she sat up fast, hand going to the knife. His voice came from the dark, even and low. Stove settling. That's all. She exhaled, slow and deliberate, and lay back down. He didn't sleep, not for a while. He listened to her breathing, counted it like a rhythm, knew that something had changed, not everything, not yet, but something, and that was enough for the first night. Dawn came thin and cold, the kind that crept in through wall, seams, and settled in the joints before a body even opened its eyes. Rowan had been awake for an hour already, laying still beneath the heavy quilt on his cot, not from discomfort, but from habit, listening again, to the wind, to the stove creaking low with its last coals, to the quiet shuffle of movement near the wall where she'd slept. Nayeli hadn't stirred much in the night, but now he heard the slight rasp of cloth against floorboard and then water being poured into the basin from the kettle he'd left warming on the stove's edge. He didn't move yet. Let her have the quiet. When he finally sat up, she was already dressed, his shirt still over her deerskin dress, the shawl from Mrs. Reyes pulled snug around her shoulders, her braid loose and falling forward as she scrubbed the basin clean with slow, deliberate circles. She didn't turn, didn't jump, just said, "You sleep loud," without inflection. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He moved to the stove, lit a match, coaxed the fire up again, and filled the tin pot with more water. Breakfast would be coffee and the last of the bread, and unless he wanted to go shoot something before noon. She spoke again, without looking up. "I'll work for the food." He turned, met her eyes. "You don't owe me." She paused then, gaze still but heavy. "Doesn't mean I sit idle." He gave a short nod. That settled that. Outside, the sky had turned the flat gray color that promised snow before nightfall. He split wood while she stacked it. She didn't fumble, didn't pause to ask which way the grain ran. She wiped each piece with the side of her sleeve, as if removing dirt made it burn cleaner. She worked without being told and took small satisfaction in the rhythm. Inside, she swept the corners of the cabin, shook out the bedding, boiled the old bones for broth, and scrubbed the knife with salt by midday. The silence between them had taken on a different weight, not wary, not distant, but deliberate, like two people moving through the same rhythm without needing to measure it out loud. There were questions hanging between them now, the kind a listener might wonder. Who had tied her to that rail? What kind of debt made a woman bound and sold in public? Why she hadn't tried to run once the rope fell? And where exactly Rowan had come from? What made a man that silent, that still? But neither one asked yet, because questions like that weren't answered with words. Not at first. Instead, he brought her a spool of thread and a needle, laid it gently on the crate beside her seat. She looked down at the offering, then at her dress, then said, "I used to sew better." He shrugged. "Better than me," he said, and returned to the doorway to check the sky. Still no snow, but the cold was deepening by late afternoon. She had mended the side seam with a line of uneven but tight stitches, the kind that held despite weather and wear. The neckline rip remained, not out of neglect but choice. A V that dipped low enough to show the high swell of her chest when she leaned forward to stoke the stove, her skin marked still from the rawhide rope. the bruising yellowing now into something livable. Rowan kept his eyes elsewhere. Not out of disinterest, that would have been a lie, but because looking too long felt like something stolen, and he didn't take what wasn't offered. Instead, he moved to the corral, began sinking 2 more posts into the half-frozen earth, boots crunching into the clay, muscles moving with the muscle memory of a man who dug trenches long before he dug graves. She watched him from the doorway once, wiping her hands on her skirt. Then she turned away and swept the floor again. At noon, a rider came, old Tomas, sitting crooked in the saddle of a tired roan, hat pulled low and scarf crooked. Rowan saw him coming and leaned the post-hole digger against the fence. "Goddamn fool thing you done," Tomas said before he even dismounted. Rowan didn't argue, just crossed his arms and waited. "She's Apache. Town ain't gonna let that lie quiet," Tomas continued, swinging down with a grunt. "Man she was tied for? Sutton's brother. They'll be talking about contracts. Paper. She's not property." Tomas snorted. "Tell them that. Hell, tell the judge." Rowan nodded once. Then, after a beat, said, "You bring meat?" "Stew cut." Left it tied behind the saddle. Tomas pulled off a glove, wiped his nose. "They'll come, son. Might be a day, might be 3. But they'll come. She ready. She doesn't need to be." Inside, Naeli didn't flinch when Tomas entered, but she stood with her back close to the hearth. He tipped his hat, mumbled something half-recognizable as a greeting, and handed her the wrapped parcel of meat. She nodded but said nothing. When Tomas was gone, Rowan stepped to the window and watched the horizon for a long minute. Later, as dusk stretched thin across the sky, he finally spoke. "The grave's out back," he said without turning. "Wife. Boy. Fever took him. 3 winters back." She didn't look surprised, just lowered her head slightly. "Mine was shot by men like those in town. Claimed he owed them for supplies. I buried him by the river. Then ran." They didn't say anything else after that. Snow came with the dark, light at first like dust, but steady. The wind pressed against the cabin like a warning. Rowan checked the latch twice. Then again. Before bed, she set the kettle near the fire and folded the shirt he'd lent her. He waved her off. "Keep it." She didn't smile, but her shoulders loosened that night as the storm scratched the roof and the wind howled like a warning past too late. She didn't sleep near the wall. She moved her bedroll half a foot closer to the stove. Not next to him, but closer. Close enough to share the heat. And when the stove popped and settled again, she didn't reach for the knife. She just listened, counted breaths like he did, point to people, side by side, pretending not to be afraid of the same things. Tomorrow they would work. Tomorrow, the first test would come. But tonight, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. The cold deepened by morning, frost webbing across the inside corners of the window pane like spider cracks in old glass. The fire burning low but steady, and the silence inside the cabin was no longer sharp but familiar. Not comfort, not yet, but something that didn't feel like danger. Rowan rose without sound, pulling on his coat, stepping out before first light to check the sky. A dusting of snow had fallen in the night, just enough to coat the firewood stack and settle in the grooves of the unfinished corral rails. It wouldn't last, but meant more was coming. Inside, Naeli had already lit the stove and swept the hearth. She moved like someone who knew the feel of borrowed spaces, who didn't touch anything she hadn't already used, who measured her weight on the floorboards and still kept her back to the wall near the door. But the shawl hung now on the peg by the stove, not clenched around her like armor. That was new. Rowan noticed. They ate in silence again, a kind that came not from lack of words but from a lack of urgency. Then Rowan slid a small cloth bag across the table. Inside, 3.44 cartridges, a folded note, and a dull-bladed penknife. "If I'm gone too long," he said, "use what makes sense." She didn't touch the bag. "Where?" "Town," he said. "Supplies. Wire for the fence. Salt if they've got it." She gave a slight nod. "You go alone? Better that way." Naeli didn't argue. She only asked one more question. "What happens if they ask?" He met her eyes then. "I tell them you're free, and they can come see what that looks like." He left by mid-morning, horse cutting tracks through the snow, rifle laid across the saddle in full view. Naeli stayed behind, standing in the doorway long after he vanished over the ridge, listening to the wind between the trees and the whistle of a lone hawk above the cottonwood. The cabin felt too still without him. But she didn't sit idle. She boiled water, cleaned the rifle, then stitched the torn edge of her sleeve, thread tugging steady between her fingers. She paused only once. When she reached in the pouch she kept folded in her things, a scrap of buckskin, 2 small beads, and a twist of red thread from shirt her husband once wore. She didn't weep, just held it in her palm for a moment, then tucked it back inside. Afternoon brought footsteps. Not Rowan. She heard the crunch of snow before the knock came. Slow, deliberate, not urgent, not polite. Her hand found the blade on the crate without looking. Then she opened the door. 3 men stood there, one with a derby hat and a roll of papers in hand, one with a smug smile, one with a rifle slung too loose over his shoulder. "Ma'am," said the man with the papers, not looking at her face, "we're here to resolve a matter of debt and ownership." Her grip tightened on the doorframe. "A man paid," she said. "Did he sign?" the man asked. "There's law in Arroyo Ford. No signature, no satisfaction. Sheer generosity, don't override contract." Behind them, Rowan's dog trotted out of the brush with a low growl that made the rifleman shift his stance. The sound was enough to draw the men back a step. "We'll return with the justice," the man in the hat added, stepping back. "This ain't over, Mississippi." They left with no shots fired. But the message was clear. When Rowan returned before sunset, Nayeli was on the porch, arms crossed, hair caught in the wind, the pouch in her pocket and the rifle leaning against the doorpost. She told him everything, that he didn't speak for a while. Just stood there, jaw clenched, then finally said, "I'll ride in tomorrow." "With you?" She raised a brow. "Why me?" "Because this isn't about who owns you. It's about who listens when you speak." They rode in the next day, quiet side by side, Rowan's rifle slung visible again, Nayeli wearing her shawl like a banner. At the justice's office, Mrs. Reyes was already there, arms folded across her apron, eyes sharp. She handed over a slip of paper, a signed statement from 2 townsfolk who'd seen the original sale. Said the price was paid in full, and the woman had spoken her own name aloud. The justice, a thin man with stained fingers and little appetite for confrontation, scratched his head and finally grumbled. "Fine. She's free. Long as she says so herself." Nayeli didn't hesitate. "I say so." That was the end of it. On the ride back, Rowan asked a question he hadn't dared before. "Why didn't you run? After I cut you loose?" She didn't look at him, just watched the road ahead. Because nowhere else had fire. They reached the cabin at dusk. She unpacked the flour, the salt, the new thread. He set the new wire by the post pile. Snow began falling again. She stirred stew on the stove while he mended the broken hinge on the door. Then she said, without turning, "You trust me now?" He paused. "I trusted you before." She gave a small smile at that. And that night, she moved her bedroll fully beside the stove. Not next to him, but not apart. And he let the fire burn longer than needed, because nowhere else had fire. The next morning came with blue shadows across the floor and smoke curling slow from the stove, the kind of cold that made a man keep his hands in his pockets longer than needed and made wood crack sharper when it split. Rowan stood outside stacking the last of the cured planks, his breath fogging in the brittle air, while inside the cabin, Nayeli wiped the counters, humming low in the back of her throat, something without lyrics, just sound that she'd taken to routines fast. Too fast, maybe. She swept, cooked, mended, cut fabric into narrow strips, boiled them in salt water to clean wounds that weren't there yet. Rowan watched from the porch sometimes, not out of suspicion, but because it was clear she'd lived in too many places that never lasted. The way she never unpacked all the way. The way her pouch stayed tucked in her skirt at all times. The way her eyes darted to the door each time it opened. Even when it was just wind that mid-morning, Rowan stepped in with his coat still on, snow shaking from the brim of his hat. "Corral's done," he said. "You want to ride fence with me?" She looked up from the pot of beans she'd been soaking. "You sure?" He nodded once. "You've been waiting on something. Figured this might be it." 10 minutes later, she stood by the gelding, fingers brushing its flank like she was testing memory. "He had a horse," she said low. "Named him Hawk. Fast. Mean. She didn't say her husband's name, and Rowan didn't ask. He just handed her the reins, waited while she adjusted the saddle cinch with practiced hands, and mounted without needing help. They rode north toward the tree line, fence posts vanishing into the brush and snow crunching beneath hooves. Neither spoke for the first mile, and it wasn't silence exactly. It was space. At the broken post, Rowan dismounted, examined the split, and said, "Elk rub. See the hair?" She knelt beside him, fingers brushing the snag of gray fur on the bark. "That's fresh. You know all this from your wartime?" she asked, but he shook his head. "From losing cattle." She stood again, her breath showing in bursts. "What happened after they died? Your wife? The boy?" Rowan took longer than needed to straighten. "I sent word to her sister in Texas. She didn't want to come. And you stayed," Naeli said, not as a question. Someone had to keep the land. "I wasn't going to give it back to the men who left it bare before." She looked away then. "That's what I did. Stayed too long somewhere I should have left sooner." They rode on. At a bend in the trail, Rowan reined in and pointed to the distant ridge. "Used to be a lookout station up there. Cavalry scouts. You ever seen it?" "I know where it is," she said. "My uncle used a trap in those woods. Before they came." "They?" "White men. Rail crew. Bounty riders. Folks who wanted the valley empty so they could cut trees and not ask." She didn't soften the words. He didn't flinch. They just rode on, the snow thickening by degrees, the world going quieter. While late afternoon, they were back at the cabin. The horse was unsaddled and fed. The beans boiled. She moved with less hesitation now, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, face red from cold but unbowed. Then came the knock. Rowan reached the door in 3 strides, hand resting on the rifle. But it wasn't trouble. It was Mrs. Reyes, bundled in wool, her breath coming fast. "Judge signed off on everything," she said, holding out a folded paper. "I figured you'd want in hand." Rowan took it, eyes scanning the crude signature, the ink barely dry. Naeli stepped closer, staying behind Rowan's shoulder, but not hiding. Reyes saw her. "Men'll still talk," she said, "but not to a judge." "Thank you," Naeli said, "Mrs." Reyes gave her a long look, then nodded once. "You keep feeding him, he might last the winter." That night, Rowan laid the signed paper on the shelf beside the rifle, not to wave it like proof, but to have it where she could see it without asking. She sat by the fire with the shawl around her shoulders, her hands busy with mending again. This time not hers, but one of his old shirts with a seam torn from wood hauling. She sewed slowly, with care. He watched her from his seat by the window, the firelight warming the side of her face. "You always this quiet?" she asked, still looking at the fabric. "Not always," he said. "Just never met someone who listened better than they talked." She smiled at that, just a little, then said, "I was married 3 years. He never learned that." "You miss him?" A pause. "I miss not being afraid all the time." Rowan looked away. The stove crackled. She folded the mended shirt, stood, and crossed to where his coat hung by the door. "Can I put this here?" she asked, holding her pouch. He nodded. She slid it onto the same peg. 2 things now. Not just hers. Not just his. When they turned in that night, she didn't lay her bedroll down separately. She rolled it out beside his, didn't ask, didn't explain. He didn't move. But he didn't stop her either. And when the wind howled again through the seams of the roof, they both listened. Not to the storm, but to the fact that neither one had reached for a blade. Not this time. Snow stayed on the ground longer that week, crusting the roof, frosting the window edges until morning light broke in blurred streaks across the cabin floor. Rowan rose first, as always, but this time he moved slower, mindful of the second body beside him, of the quiet weight of breath that wasn't his. Naeli slept with one hand tucked under her cheek, the other curled near the edge of his old quilt, not holding it, not clinging, just close. When she stirred, she didn't jolt or reach for the knife. She blinked once, met his eyes, and said, "It's still snowing," like it was just fact, not warning. He made coffee. She made corn cakes. Neither spoke for a while, not because there was tension, but because this was how mornings moved now. Not rushed, not jagged, just shared up. By mid-morning they were outside, clearing a path to the woodshed, snow nearly up to her calves where the drift had settled against the lean-to. She held the shovel. He carried the wood. When he slipped once on the ice-packed ground, she laughed, not loud, not mocking, just a short breath of surprise that turned into something warmer. He looked at her with half a smile, shaking snow off his coat. You think that's funny? You look surprised, she said. Like the ground betrayed you. I forget to watch sometimes, he said. But I'll remember. That made her pause. Why? She asked. You planning to stay alert for me? Rowan didn't answer at first. Just tossed another split log into the stack, then turned to her. I ain't had a reason to watch anything in a long time. That stilled her. Then she nodded once, slow. That was enough. Inside, the warmth returned, stew simmering low, the sharp scent of cedarwood mixing with the scent of beans and thawed onions. She cleaned the table. He patched the loose hinge on the window. Outside, a raven settled on the fence rail, shaking snow off its wings before flapping off toward the cottonwood. Neither of them mentioned it, but both watched it go to mid-afternoon, brought a change neither expected. Sarah? Not her name. Just a girl, maybe 7, wrapped in 2 big furs and riding a mule that looked half-starved, slumped forward in the saddle as if she'd been riding far too long. Rowan spotted her first, his brow knitting tight. He stepped off the porch just as the mule stopped at the post. She didn't speak. Just slid off, stumbled once, then straightened. There was dried blood on her lip, and her right hand was wrapped in a filthy strip of cloth. Naeli moved first. Get her inside. Rowan carried her in, set her near the stove. The girl didn't cry, didn't ask where she was, just stared down at her boots, one of which was missing its sole entirely. She yours? Naeli asked, voice low. Rowan shook his head. Never seen her before. She know you? No, the girl spoke then. He said to come here. Said the man with the stitch coat would help. Rowan crouched. Who told you that? Old man. At the ridge. Her voice cracked. He died in the night. Where's your people? Naeli asked gently. Gone, the girl whispered. House burned. Mama too. They didn't ask more. That night, they made a place for her near the fire, gave her bread soaked in broth, and wrapped her in 2 quilts. She slept hard, limbs twitching like a dog's dreams. Rowan stood near the stove long after the girl had gone quiet. That ridge, he said. She must have passed through Tomas's land. Naeli looked up. You think it was him? Could have been. Could be he sent her here when he knew he wouldn't last. You gonna bury him if it was? Rowan nodded. Come first thaw. They stood there in the firelight, watching the girl breathe. Naeli spoke soft. You think we're meant to raise her? I don't think anything's meant, he said. But she's here. And we're here. She finished. He glanced at her then. You sure? Don't ask if I'm sure, she said. I stay. That includes her. Later that night, while the child slept, Rowan stepped out into the yard. Snow fell light now. Just flurries. He looked at the sky, then at the house. Smoke rising, 2 pairs of boots by the door now, and a 3rd smaller set drying near the hearth. When he came back in, Naeli had taken her pouch off the peg. She was kneeling by the fire, needle in hand, sewing a red thread loop into the girl's torn sleeve that he knelt beside her. Watched. Didn't speak. Then he reached into his coat and took out a scrap of cedar. For the names, he said. She nodded. 3 now. He laid the plank on the table. Tomorrow he'd carve it. Not to claim, but to remember, because sometimes fire wasn't just for warmth. It was a sign a house wasn't empty anymore. The girl's name was Clara. She didn't say it right away. It came out 2 mornings later, half mumbled over a tin cup of watered-down coffee. She insisted on sipping like an adult. Rowan had asked her how old she was, and she'd shrugged. Then Naeli asked her name, softer, slower, and Clara had whispered it without looking up. That was all. No last name. No talk of where she'd come from. Just Clara, and the way she gripped the tin mug said she hadn't had much that was hers in a long time. The weather turned worse. Snow thickened over the ridge, buried the old path leading toward Tomas's land. No one came up the trail. Not riders, not lawmen, not the men with paper and threats. Maybe word had spread. Maybe they just didn't want to climb through drifts to make trouble. Either way, the cabin grew quieter again. But not the same kind of quiet it had been before. Now, there were 3 sets of hands working. Rowan out with the posts and axe, Naeli at the hearth or sweeping, and Clara learning the small rhythms of survival. She was a quiet child, but not helpless. She watched everything. How Rowan patched a leak in the roof using strips of hide. How Nayeli turned bone and broth into something hearty. She asked questions rarely, but when she did, they were sharp. "Why do you check the door twice before you sleep?" she asked Rowan one night. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Because once I didn't." She blinked. "What happened?" "Doesn't matter now," he said. "I lived. Others didn't." Clara nodded, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. Later, while the stew boiled, Nayeli sat by the fire, brushing Clara's hair out in long, slow strokes with her fingers and humming something in a language the girl didn't know, but leaned into anyway. She had taken to Nayeli fast, not with words, but with touch. Her small frame always close, her shoulder pressed to Nayeli's leg during meals, her feet tucked under the woman's blanket at night. Rowan watched the two of them one evening, sitting by the firelight, and something in his chest pulled tight. Not from fear, not from doubt, but from a kind of ache he'd forgotten had a name. He stepped outside to split wood and didn't come back in for nearly an hour. When he did, Clara had fallen asleep by the stove, a quilt up to her chin. Nayeli stood at the table with a tin bowl in her hands, filling it with warm water. "You left fast," she said. "I needed air." "You always run from good things?" Rowan looked at her, really looked. Her braid was loose down her back, a few strands fallen over her cheek. The neckline of her dress still torn slightly where the beadwork had never been fully repaired. The shape of her body wasn't hidden anymore. It was simply there, part of the room, part of the house. "I don't run," he said. "I just forget what to do with peace." She placed the bowl on the table. "It's just a girl and a pot of beans, Rowan. Not a war. You weren't there when the peace broke last time." "I was in my own war," she said, "and I still chose to stay." That stopped him. She came closer then, not rushed. Just a step, then another. "I need to know," she said, voice low but steady, "if this is just safety or something more." He didn't answer at first. His eyes dropped to her hands, one holding the bowl, the other now resting on the table's edge, fingers brushing the carved cedar plaque he hadn't finished. 3 names. Hers. His. Clara's. No dates yet. Just the start. "I don't have the right words," he said. "Good," she replied. "I don't want words. I want to know if you'll stay when the ground gets ugly again." "I will." "Then show me," she whispered. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not rushed, not possessive, just contact. They stood that way a long moment. Her fingers curled slow around his, their palms meeting like old truths being relearned. Then the child stirred in the corner, and Nayeli pulled her hand back, the moment breaking but not vanishing. They moved through the next days like something had shifted. Clara asked to help chop carrots. Nayeli let her. Rowan taught her how to sand a fence rail without cutting her hand. She tried, failed, tried again. The mornings were filled with work, the afternoons with repair, the nights with quiet talk and firelight. And then, just before dusk one evening, the sound came, hooves, fast. Rowan stepped out with his rifle before the first figure reached the rise. It was a woman, alone, Apache, barefoot, dress torn high along one side, hair unbound and tangled with brush. She stumbled into the yard before the horse even stopped, her face wild with panic, eyes locked not on Rowan, but on Nayeli, who had stepped into the doorway behind him. The woman dropped to her knees, gasping something in a language Rowan didn't know. Nayeli ran to her. Kneeling, she touched the woman's face, muttered a string of words too fast for Rowan to follow, then stood and looked at him. "She's my cousin," Nayeli said. "They're coming." "Who?" "Men from the fort. Looking for her. She escaped." Rowan turned to Clara. "Inside. Lock the door." To Nayeli. "How long do we have?" "An hour, maybe. Then we dig in." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The cabin wasn't just shelter now. It was theirs, and no one was taking it without a fight. They had less than an hour. Snow still clung to the corners of the yard, crusted against the edges of the split-rail fence, but Rowan didn't notice the cold anymore. He moved fast, jaw set, pulling the rifle from the cabin wall, checking the cartridges, then the sidearm in the drawer. Always kept clean, always loaded. Nayeli was already moving blankets and crates to block the lower part of the windows. Her cousin still weak, but conscious, breathing rough by the stove. Clara sat cross-legged on the cot, hands tied around her knees, saying nothing. Rowan crouched by the door and looked at Nayeli. How many? She shook her head. She says 4. Maybe 5. They caught others from the old camp last week. She ran 2 nights. No food. No boots. Why are they chasing her? He asked as Nayeli's eyes darkened. Because she said no. He didn't press, thought he just nodded, stepped outside, and started cutting a trench in the snow between the yard and the shed. Not for defense, but to force a path to narrow the line if the men came shooting. He tamped it with his boots, then drove 2 sharpened posts into the earth on either side, tied wire between them. By the time he came back inside, Nayeli had wrapped her cousin in dry wool and was ladling warm broth to her lips. She stood when she saw him, wiped her hands, and crossed the room. You sure about this? She asked. They might come with papers again, or flags. If they want her back, they'll have to walk in on their feet, Rowan said. And not one of them is taking her out of here screaming. Her voice dropped. I don't want Clara to see blood. Then let's end it before that. They moved in sync after that. Clara lit the lamps and turned them down low. Nayeli sharpened the old skinning knife, her hands steady, her face tight. Rowan took the second rifle, Tomas's, still kept clean on a hook by the door, and laid it beside the crate. Then, for a moment, everything stilled. The fire crackled. The woman by the stove stirred in sleep. Clara leaned against Nayeli's leg, her face half hidden in the folds of the shawl. Rowan crossed the peg near the door and picked up the cedar plank. The names weren't finished, the last one only half carved, but he held it like it mattered, like it meant something worth guarding. Then came the sound of hooves, slow, deliberate, crunching snow in steady beats, not rushed, not loud. Men who knew how to ride without wasting motion. Rowan stepped out first. Rifle lowered, eyes fixed. 3 men dismounted in the yard. One stayed seated, a pale-haired man with silver spurs and a revolver that gleamed too clean in the firelight. You Rowan Pike? He asked. Depends, Rowan said. You the ones chasing women through snowdrifts? The pale man smiled without warmth. We got claim. That girl in there stole military property. She ain't property. She belonged to a camp under contract. She said no. Rowan said. You didn't listen. She's a fugitive. Not from my house. The man dismounted slow, motion practiced, calculated. You sure you want this, Pike? Rowan didn't answer. Just lifted the rifle. Not aimed, just visible. Behind him, Nayeli stepped into the doorway. She wasn't holding a gun, just a ladle, the same one she'd used to serve soup that morning. But her posture didn't bend. Her face didn't flinch. She's blood to me, she said. Try it. The men looked between them. One spat into the snow. Another shifted his boots. The one with the spurs took 1 step closer. And that's when a shotgun cracked behind the cottonwood tree. Misses. Reyes stepped out from the shadow, the stock tucked into her shoulder, her apron dusted with snow, her face hard. That's close enough, she said. Town doesn't want you here. You ain't law, the man growled. No, she said. I'm worse. I bake for all the deputies. And I tell stories. He hesitated. Then Rowan stepped forward just once. Last warning. The men looked around, at the cabin, at the wire posts, at the woman in the doorway, at the figure behind the tree. Too many risks. No easy reward. The man in the spurs turned. Ain't worth it, he said to the others. Then, over his shoulder to Rowan, this ain't over. Rowan just said, it is if you want it to be. They rode off without another word. The quiet that returned was thicker than any storm. Inside, the cabin was warm again. Clara climbed onto the cot beside Nayeli's cousin and curled up without fear. Nayeli leaned against the doorframe, breath shaking, but her eyes dry. Rowan sat down at the table and ran a hand over his face at Mrs. Reyes stepped in, brushed snow from her boots. You owe me bread, she said. You'll get it, Nayeli said, voice hoarse. Reyes looked between them. You two gonna make this permanent? Rowan looked at Nayeli. She met his eyes. Then she walked over to the peg, took down her pouch, and set on the shelf beside the cedar plaque. I'm not leaving, she said. And Rowan reached for her hand, not to pull, not to hold her down, but just to feel it settle in his. He kissed her for the first time then, slow, deliberate, Not because of fear, not because of survival, but because staying had become the truest thing he had left to offer.
This story is produced by Wild West Love Story YouTube channel. Unauthorized use is prohibited. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.
She leaned into it, and in the corner, Clara whispered to the cousin, "I think. We live here now." And that night, the cabin sounded like a home. Snow melted slow over the next week. The thaw came not with warmth, but with silence, the kind that settles when danger's past, when everyone still waits for the next noise, but nothing comes. Water dripped from the eaves in steady rhythm. Mud replaced drifts in the yard. Tracks, once covered, began to show again. Boots, hooves, bare feet from that frantic night when Naeli's cousin had arrived and thrown every plan they had in a firelight. Inside, the cabin had changed. Not its size, not its walls, still one room, still creaking at night, still patched in places with canvas and nail, but its feel. There were more things now. Clara's small wooden spoon. A second shawl hung beside the first. A pair of half-minute moccasins set by the stove. And the cedar plaque, finished at last, names carved careful and unflinching. Rowan, Naeli, Clara, Sani. Sani, the cousin, had begun to speak again, her voice soft but sure, her Apache accent stronger than Naeli's. She spoke little English, but she watched and listened and knew how to move through a room without taking more space than she needed. She took to Clara quickly, teaching her words in whispered syllables while brushing her hair by the fire. Rowan didn't understand a word of it, but he liked the sound, soft, careful, purposeful. Like someone rebuilding something they thought they'd never hold again, that he didn't ask if Sani was staying, that he didn't have to. Naeli had already started sewing a new dress from the old canvas bags they kept from grain deliveries. It was rough, sure, but she lined it with the fabric from her own hem. When Rowan saw that, he didn't speak. He just added another plank to the bunk frame he'd started building beside the cot. They'd need more sleeping space, soon. One morning, Clara ran into the cabin with a wild look in her eye and shouted, "Chickens!" Rowan had raised a brow. "We don't have chickens." "We do now." She grinned, holding up a crate. "Mrs. Reyes said you owed her bread, but she said this was better. 3 hens and a rooster. They squawked like devils. Sani named them in Apache. Clara renamed them in English." Rowan built a pen. Naeli baked the first loaf in 3 days, then another, just to make sure it hadn't been luck. Later, as the sun dropped low and they all sat outside on crates and stumps, Sani plucking one of Rowan's old coats into stuffing for a pillow, Clara feeding crushed beans to the hens, Naeli turned to him and asked the one question that hadn't been said out loud yet. "What now?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really looked, her cheeks red from wind, the tear at her neckline finally patched, but still shaped where it once pulled, her hand resting steady on her knee, fingers dusted in flour. Then he looked at Sani, then at Clara. "I finished the bunk. We build a second coop. After that, maybe we try to make it through the next season with a full roof and no men at our gate." "That all?" she asked, voice teasing. He turned back. "That's everything." That night, Clara asked if she could sleep with Sani. "Just to listen," she said. "I like her words." Naeli smiled and nodded. Rowan carried the cedar plank to the mantel, nailed it in firm, then hung the pouch Naeli once kept at her skirt just below it, not hidden, not clutched, displayed. They lay beside each other later, not speaking for a while. Just the sound of boots drying near the door, the fire soft in the stove, a hen outside clucking once like it had something important to say and no one to listen. Then Naeli rolled toward him and rested her forehead against his jaw. "I used to think quiet meant I was alone," she whispered. "Now it just means no one's running." Rowan slid his arm around her waist and let his hand settle at the small of her back, where the fabric still held the memory of her torn dress, now mended, now chosen. "No one's running," he said. "Not anymore." And in the morning, he'd mark the post for the new chicken run, because building was how he said, "I love you now," and she understood it better than words. By spring, the ground had softened enough to take a post. Without a mallet. After that, maybe we try to make it through the next season with a full roof and no men at our gate. "That all?" she asked, voice teasing. He turned back. "That's everything." That night, Clara asked if she could sleep with Sani. "Just to listen," she said. I like her words. Naeli smiled and nodded. Rowan carried the cedar plank to the mantel, nailed it in firm, then hung the pouch Naeli once kept in her skirt just below it, not hidden, not clutched, displayed. They lay beside each other later, not speaking for a while. The thaw had worked its way deep into the soil, bringing green at the edges of the fence line and puddles by the water barrels. Days were longer now. The sun hit the porch early and stayed late, and the smoke that once clung to the eaves all day had turned to steam rising off morning coffee. Inside the cabin, nothing dramatic had changed, but everything had. There was a second bunk now, sturdy, hand-built, where Sonny slept with a folded shawl beneath her head and a small braid down her shoulder. Clara had claimed the cot by the window, saying she liked to see the sky before sleep. The room smelled of flour, ash, fresh-cut wood, and someone always humming. Sometimes it was Naeli, sometimes Sonny. Once or twice, even Clara. The hen scratched freely in the yard now. Rowan had expanded the pen and even built a gate for them, though Naeli teased that he'd gone soft. "You ever build your wife a gate like that?" she'd asked once. He had paused, looked at her, and answered honest. No, didn't know how to build one that held without keeping someone in. That day, they planted corn. They worked side by side, Rowan turning the soil, Naeli dropping seeds, Clara patting them down, Sonny hauling water in small buckets with a grin that was new and real. It wasn't just chores anymore. It was theirs. Later, when Clara asked how long corn took to grow, Rowan said, "Long enough to see who stays." She nodded. "Then we better all be here." One evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, Mrs. Reyes rode up again, not with warning or shotgun this time, but with cloth bundles tied behind her saddle. Inside were boots for Clara, shoes for Sonny, a tin of salt, and a note scribbled in sharp cursive. "You made your home louder. That means it's real." She didn't stay long, just drank a half cup of weak coffee, kissed Clara's hair, and left before full dark. "You ever need anything," she said at the door, "don't write. Just send one of those girls down the ridge. I'll know." That night, Naeli stood by the cedar plaque, one hand tracing the names. "You gonna add more?" she asked Rowan, her voice quiet but steady. He was leaning by the stove, boots crossed, mug in hand. "Only if you tell me which name's yours now." She looked over her shoulder, not smiling, but something close to it in her eyes. "Still Naeli, just not someone else's anymore." "You ever want it," he said, "I'll carve it twice. I'll tell you when." She crossed to him then, slow but sure, and slid her arms around his waist. He held her there, chin resting against her temple, and they just stood like that, fire warm at their side, the sound of Sonny softly singing in Apache as she braided Clara's hair in the corner. Later, after everyone had gone quiet, Rowan stepped outside alone, took in the cabin lit by the warm flicker of lamp oil and stove flame, smoke curling up through the chimney in a slow ribbon. The corral stood full. The fence held. The porch sagged a little where Clara had jumped off it too many times, pretending to be a rider or outlaw or hero. There were boot prints beside his now. Smaller, lighter, lasting. He turned, looked back through the window. Naeli stood barefoot inside, her deerskin dress now fully mended, the neckline patched not to hide but to finish. Her hair was loose. Her gaze was soft. When she caught him watching, she didn't turn away. She walked to the door, opened it, and leaned against the frame. "You ever stop counting risks?" she asked. "I stopped counting the day you stayed," he said. She tilted her head. "Then come in." And he did. They sat by the fire, side by side, her legs tucked under her, his hand resting over hers. Clara had fallen asleep curled against Sonny, both of them blanketed in a quilt stitched from scraps of old shirts, old flour sacks, old lives, and no words were said after that. But when Naeli rested her head on his shoulder and his hand slid to the small of her back, fingers curling in a fabric he now knew by heart, it was clear that what they'd built, post by post, word by word, breath by breath, wasn't just shelter. It was family. And no paper, no name, no fire from the past could take that from them. Now in the morning, they'd gather eggs. In the afternoon, Rowan would ride into town for hinges and nails. And before dusk, he'd start framing a new room. Because this house wasn't just full, it was growing. And this time, they all got to stay by. Early summer, Everything had roots. The corn pushed through the soil in straight, stubborn rows. Lasting, he turned, looked back through the window. Nayeli stood barefoot inside, her deerskin dress now fully mended, the neckline patched not to hide but to finish. Her hair was loose. Her gaze was soft. When she caught him watching, she didn't turn away. She walked to the door, opened it, and leaned against the frame. "You ever stop counting risks?" she asked. "I stopped counting the day you stayed," he said. She tilted her head. "Then come in." And he did. They sat by the fire, side by side, her legs tucked under her, his hand resting over hers. The hens had taken to roosting near the cabin's lean-to, one of them nesting in the hollow of Rowan's old boots until Clara lined the box with straw and claimed it as the queen spot. The wind had softened. It still carried dust, still lifted the edges of loose nails and old cloth, but it no longer felt like a warning, just part of the land, part of their rhythm. And inside, the cabin breathed like a living thing. There was a rhythm now. Sonny rose first, started water. Clara came next, always sleepy, always with one sock half off, climbing onto the bench like she'd lived here her whole life. Nayeli was last, but not because she lagged. She liked to watch the way the day started. The way Rowan stretched his back on the porch steps. The way the early light touched the ridge behind the cottonwood. The way safety had stopped feeling like luck and started feeling like fact. The second room was half framed by then. Just walls, no roof. Rowan worked on it after the morning chores, sometimes with Sonny's help. She didn't say much, but she measured well and didn't mind splinters. Clara handed him nails one by one, serious as any apprentice. "What's it for?" she'd asked. He glanced at Nayeli, who was mending a hem in the sun. "Whatever we need it to be. Bedroom. Could be. Schoolroom. If someone wants to teach." She grinned. "I'll think about it." The last of the threats had never returned. Not the paper men, not the ones with spurs and stories of claims. Whatever had held them back, the judge's signature, Reyes's shotgun, the quiet coalition of townfolk who'd seen what was being built, it had worked. And Rowan had taken to keeping the rifle hung by the door instead of leaning by the bed. Not because he trusted the world now, but because he trusted this piece of it. And that afternoon, in the warmth that settled just before rain, he asked her that no speech. No ring. Just a moment in the quiet, with Clara asleep on the floor beside the cedar plaque and Sonny humming as she stirred beans. Rowan stepped beside Nayeli as she stood at the sink, washing the last of the day's dust from her hands. "I was thinking," he said, voice even. "That name of yours. You want to carve again?" She turned her head, studied him. "Where would it go?" He pointed beside his beneath the roof beam. "And what would it say?" He swallowed once. "Yours. But mine too, if you want it." Nayeli didn't speak right away. She dried her hands on her skirt, wiped a smudge of flour from her forearm, then reached up, brushed his jaw with her thumb. "Only if it stays mine first." He nodded. "It does." She leaned in, pressed her forehead to his. "Then yes." He carved it the next day, not deep, not fancy, but steady. Nayeli Pike. Below it, a small symbol she asked for, 2 beads and a thread. Not for decoration. For remembrance. Mrs. Reyes came out 2 days later with a bundle of cotton and a half-burned loaf of sweetbread. "That for celebration?" she asked, motioning to the carved name. Nayeli grinned. "That depends." "On what?" "On if you'll stand beside me when we say it out loud." Reyes sniffed. "Someone's got to keep you all pointed straight. I'll bring the preacher next week. The one who listens more than he talks." The wedding was quiet. The tea took place under the cottonwood, just before dusk. Sonny braided Nayeli's hair. Clara carried the cedar plaque like it was crown. Rowan wore his cleanest shirt, the one she'd stitched. The vows were few, the promises fewer, but they all stayed. That night, the second fire was lit, one in the stove, and one outside where they sat in the dirt, roasting beans and flatbread, watching the stars break through the dusk. Rowan held her hand, fingers twined. Sonny leaned back on her elbows, face to the sky. Clara, full of food and tired of questions, fell asleep with her head in Nayeli's lap, and the cabin behind them glowed. Not grand, not new, but whole, because in the end, what they'd built wasn't just a home that was a place no one had to run from, and that was enough to last.